Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotus. Today I have Christian Wagner of Militant Thomist with me to discuss Saint John Henry Newman. So how are you doing, Christian?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about with you is the role that John Henry Newman played in your own journey into the Catholic Church, because you started off, if I remember correctly, I don't remember which Protestant background you had, but you eventually came through Anglicanism and discovered John Henry Newman, which eventually brought you to the Catholic Church. So wondering if you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, so I was in the Reformed world before I became Anglican because I went to a Reformed undergraduate school, went to Reformation Bible College. And I didn't mention this in the Swan interview, but eventually I was actually kicked out of that school because I started reading John Henry Newman. So
Oh,
he
interesting.
got me
Yeah.
kicked out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What in
so
particular was it? Was it just having any involvement within that world, or?
Yeah, so when I was first Anglican, I was kind of just normal, like vanilla Reformed Anglican. And then when COVID started, I started reading into this was halfway through my first year there. I started reading into the Oxford Divines, where I ran into John Henry Newman. He was one of them. Read the Development of Doctrine, then I read Grammar of Assent, and then I read Lectures on Justification. I read a lot of his stuff, and that brought in higher views of the sacraments and of the visible church and of tradition and all the typical stuff and of medieval liturgy. And once that kind of hit and I started assenting to these doctrines, especially in regard to the sacraments, uh, the next year of my this was a year before I graduated. Yeah, that's when I got kicked out. But they they had heard through somebody who was talking about a few of us, because there's actually a few of us from the school that have since converted. Um, they had heard that I had assented to a few things on the Eucharist, and that brought about some trouble. And then they talked to me about that, and it was within it. So when it comes to the Protestant world, I'm sure in any Protestant dealings you have with anybody, really, you see lower views of the sacraments and lower views of a lot of the things that Catholics hold dear. But it wasn't like that historically. Going into a period called the Reformed Scholastics and the Reformed Orthodox, and what I was saying about baptism, such as that baptism objectively regenerates or that Christ is objectively present in the Eucharist, that was pretty commonplace back then, and that's actually within the larger scope of the Reformation. There wasn't this Zwinglian sort of way of thinking that is in the modern Protestant church. That was in the Reformed churches back then. There was a very high view of the sacraments.
Yeah. Yeah, we were discussing this a little bit before we came on, but I know a little bit about the federal vision movement within the reform circles that was going on probably around the same time you were reading a lot of this stuff. So I'm curious if that played any role at all.
Not really. I got it more through the what's called the Muller movement. So there's this guy named Richard Muller who started focusing on earlier Reformed divines, and he really got into translation work, translating them into English, and got into Thomism and Aristotelianism, and started turning the clock back on a lot of the changes that happened through the 19th and 20th century evangelicals, especially in America, who downplayed the sacraments and downplayed a lot of the metaphysics that an earlier Reformed generation really held dear. So I got into it through that, not necessarily through the Federal Vision. But it's interesting because Federal Vision is kind of like the Oxford movement of Presbyterians. Is as every church goes through this sort of pattern of the Oxford movement in the Protestant world, where they recover. They start reading the Fathers again. They start reading the medievals again, and they realize that the history of the church on wholesale didn't look like they look today, and they start reading some good stuff back then and realizing that they want to capture some of those elements and they start changing native elements of their tradition to match and to synthesize with earlier generations.
Yep.
So federal vision is kind of within the same framework, but it's in a different direction. There's a few weird things that federal vision has picked up, but I'm not too well read on federal vision actually.
Okay, yeah. I think there might be some of this parallel just because when you have this very sort of low church evangelical theology, it might be very
Mhm.
effective at something like missionary work or sort of reaching out to people, but it seems like it doesn't have the substance to survive for many generations. Because one of the things that the Catholic Church did is always integrate into the culture and transform the whole culture. And it seems like unless you have a theology that's going to touch every aspect of society, a very anti-Gnostic theology, that's going to be necessary. And part of that, I think the essential part of that is liturgy as the central organizing element of a society.
Yeah, I agree with you. That definitely within the federal vision movement was something which was central also in within the Oxford movement in the Anglican tradition. If you look at federal vision, it's interesting because you'll see guys like Peter Lightheart, they'll wear albs to worship, and they'll practice a lot of things that is not native in most of the traditional Reformed and broadly Protestant tradition. But besides Lutheranism, of course, Lutheranism is actually they're in a weird spot because they've kept a lot of the outward aesthetics of traditionalism, but they haven't been as effective at bringing people into it and seeing them as a valid option. And I do really think it has to do a lot with the episcopacy, especially with the Lutherans.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And how was when you were a Reformed Anglican, how did things look then? Was it essentially this very high church worship, keeping all of that, or was it very low church? Because I've met Anglicans who are both ways.
Well, when I was a Reformed Anglican, I mean my church stayed the same, but theologically, it's really interesting because most people don't realize this. But looking at the Oxford movement, it actually an aesthetical, wasn't a movement of aesthetics. It was really just a theological movement. Like guys like E.B. Pusey, their entire lives wouldn't have worn and would have fought against people who would have worn sacrificial vestments, for example. They would have worn the traditional reformed um, vestments. They wouldn't have veered into any of these high church practices. And a lot of their younger followers who did want to veer into that, they fought against.
Oh,
So
interesting.
yeah, so the Oxford movement wasn't as much a movement of aesthetics like people try to frame it, but it really was a theological movement trying to focus on the sacraments and to go against a lot of the tides in English theology during the time, like latitudinarianism, who successfully got the English church to allow a memorialist view of baptism, which caused a lot of, for example, Cardinal Manning. He went into the Catholic Church after the decision to allow the Zwinglian view of baptism in the English Church.
And was there anything causing this? Because I don't know that much on Anglican history, but it seems to me when I read the 39 articles that it already feels like there's this very strong reformed current within Anglicanism. So is the Oxford movement mostly just trying to get back to this more traditional reformed view or traditional within the reformed tradition, or is it
No,
trying to get back to a more maybe medieval view?
yeah, so with the Oxford movement, there's two views of the church, the English church during that time, and then to this day, uh, some are going to view the Anglican church as the English expression of the Reformation, and then others are going to view the Anglican church as the English expression of Latin Catholicism. So these two views came to head with the debate surrounding the Oxford movement, because the 39 articles, they are a reformed document. There's no way of getting around it. They condemn a lot of things um, that true Catholics would hold dear, like for example, icons. They're iconoclastic, and they go against the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and then they're going to go against the ecumenical councils of the Latin West after the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So you have two views of the church going on, and they're not working together because there's obvious theological differences. that are going to go on between the two. Like during the 17th century, especially, you have these guys. They're called the Caroline Divines because they're under King Charles, and they were a little more about the aesthetics. But the Oxford movement points back to them as their precursors. But what's interesting is, for example, you read Lancelot Andrewes, one of the guys that they really focus on, who had a really big impact and was one of the guys who translated the KJV and was a pretty important bishop. And he's still Sabbatarian. He's still iconoclastic. He's definitely a reformed guy, but in the English church. So that, like, historically, when it comes to the post-Reformation era in the Anglican Church, the Reformed Anglicans have the argument. They've won it historically. When it comes to theologically, obviously, the Oxford movement participates more fully in the truth.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioning the Lancelot Andrewes iconoclasm. It just sort of was funny because I have this icon. Here we go. I can get it of Saint Benedict over here, which I got from Lancelot Andrewes Press.
Yeah, I love Lancelot Andrewes Press. They have I think they're Western Rite Orthodox, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I helped some of their books and stuff too. When I was Orthodox, I got a bunch of their stuff.
Yeah, they're really into the Western Rite and bringing back the liturgical heritage of the English Church, and that plays in a lot to how the Anglican Ordinariate works too, because because the Oxford movement really reaches, at least what I found in my conversion, it really reaches its telos within the Anglican Ordinariate. Is that's going to be the true English expression of Latin Catholicism?
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you say then? You seem to have this memorialist view of baptism. Do you think that's still then within the Reformed camp of it, or do you think that's going even further than the Reformed camp was?
That's going much further than the Reformed camp, because you're not going to find any Reformed guys. Like even Zwingli, it's really questionable. Like pointing back to Zwingli as being the first memorialist is a trope. And it's not as founded as we would believe. Zwingli had a much higher view of the sacraments than the Zwinglians. There's kind of like a Zwingli versus the Zwinglians view going on there, because every Reformed person you're going to talk to back then are going to be able to say that baptism regenerates. Now they're going to distinguish that. Some are going to say that baptism regenerates insofar as it's applied to the elect. And then others are going to say baptism regenerates objectively, but not in the same sense in which we say regeneration, because they have to still keep up the perseverance of the saints. So the Lutheran and Reformed Baptist views of baptism are going to be distinguished, but memorialism is completely out of step. That would be like saying that credo baptism is an acceptable view in the English Church. That's really why so many from the Oxford movement realized that what they were a part of wasn't an expression of the Catholic Church, and they had to join the true church. That's what happened historically through their investigations. That happened a lot personally with me, is that over time I began to realize that what I was a part of wasn't the Catholic Church. Like I could try to cope all I wanted to, but I could try to give my cookie cutter arguments all I wanted to, but the truth of the matter is that I was within a communion who did have credo Baptist priests. It's really interesting. The ACNA had credo Baptist priests. The ACNA had female priests. The ACNA had memorialists, and it wasn't the expression of Catholicism that I was trying to argue that it was.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. It does seem to me, if you look back at church history, especially even at the earliest days of the church, there wasn't this concept of distinct national churches. They viewed each other all as one church. And this is something that it would seem hard to, from an Anglican perspective, justify from the history of the church. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can't remember who asked me about this. Somebody did recently ask me about this. So the Anglicans, when it comes to English church history, it is really, really awkward, because the English church had a history of doing what Henry VIII did. Like there was plenty of kings who tried to declare their autonomy in the medieval era from the Roman pontiff. That doesn't mean that they're right. It just means that there's a history that they could point back to. This wasn't anything new
Yeah.
when Henry VIII decided to declare supremacy over the English church.
Yeah.
So with English church identity, it is a bit different, but generally, yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct. There isn't this nationalism.
Yeah. And it might be England can get away with it a little bit because it's off on an island there. I've read about a bunch about the relationship between the kings of France and the papacy. And the papacy had a hard enough job trying to rein in the kings of France and often lost those fights when
Yeah,
France was just bordering them right there. And so it could be so much harder to get.
yeah. That definitely had to play a part of it. That and it's a lot more. The Reformation was a lot more political than as somebody who's read a lot into the causes of the Reformation and the reason why it happened and the motivating factors of each one of the figures. Like you have in the Anglican Church, you'll have Henry VIII, who most people don't know this, but he was declared a defender of the faith by the Pope at the time for writing against Luther. And even when the split happened, he still hated Luther. He basically all he wanted was English Catholicism. He wanted all of the dogmas of the church to be kept. He just didn't want the to be under the foot of the Pope. That's kind of how it went. And then on the other side, you have guys like Archbishop Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and he wanted something completely different. He wanted the liturgy and the vernacular. He wanted reformed. He wanted justification by faith to be the central point of the liturgy. That's what there's different people who have different motivations who played into the Reformation and made it much more complex than a lot of times pop Catholics and pop Orthodox and even pop Protestants like to point to it as being. It's something much deeper than either side would like to admit.
Yeah. No, I often think that the pop apologetics of any subject I've ever encountered are always very bad. This is why people have asked me to try and do more apologetics videos for this channel, and I do almost no apologetics videos because I think apologetics is often just creates more issues than it actually solves.
Yeah, I honestly agree. Like that's kind of one of the things I want to help going into the Catholic Church as somebody who went to an undergraduate I didn't graduate, but I went to an undergraduate institution, was a year away from graduating in Protestant scholastic theology. And then I'm currently in a graduate program studying Protestant scholastic theology. Like I'm somebody in a pretty good position who's read on both sides pretty deeply and have read Bellarmine, have read Whitaker, have read not all of the response to Bellarmine. There's like 140, but I've read a lot of them, and I'm able to understand the Protestant arguments and to give them a fair shake and not just point to them as Zwingli and 21st century American evangelical Baptists.
Yeah.
Like that's not what Protestantism is historically, and there's still a small group of people who are going to hold faithful to their original vision that need to be reached in Catholic apologetics.
Yeah. And I think this is the discussion of whether we're searching for truth when we're going through theology, or are we searching to win an argument? Because if we're searching to win an argument, it's just going to become bad apologetics rather than actually trying to find the truth. And I've found the things I'm most convinced of are the things I don't spend much time arguing with people on. It's the things I've just read a lot about.
Yeah.
And even though sometimes I'll look into something and I end up being convinced of the other view, that's how I came to Catholicism, was heavily through apologetics to respond to Catholicism.
Oh, were you at all into like recording videos and writing before your conversion?
No, I wasn't. I was very involved in the Facebook apologetics scene. So I was on all the major like Christian Facebook groups debating people and stuff.
Yeah, Facebook apologetics rarely go well.
Yeah. And I was
better than Twitter.
Yeah, I started off a lot of this in my senior year of high school. And as a senior in high school, I'd read a few books. I thought I knew everything on theology. And when you encounter people on Facebook forums who've read 0 books and you've read like 2 books on the subject, you think you know everything that could possibly be known about the subject. And so Yeah, I think that's why there, I think, is a big movement among Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox right now, wanting to go back to the roots of their tradition. So, like you're mentioning, I think you said you're studying at the Davenant Institute. So they're going back
Yes.
and really grasping that Reformed Protestant tradition. You then have within the Orthodox world a lot of people who want to set aside 20th century Orthodox polemics. They want to set aside people like Romanides and Losky and really go back and read Gregory Palamas and read Maximus the Confessor. Or it's interesting, there's also Orthodox who'd rather go back and read some of that Russian theology from the 16 and 1700s that's ignored. And then there's also people from the Catholic world. I think there's some wanting to go back to the fathers. There's a big movement of wanting to go back to St. Thomas. And of course, I think a number of people are seeing going back to maybe some of the other traditions within the Catholic Church, so going to Scotus and Suarez and some of these other ones. And I think all of this is a general move within the Christian world of being dissatisfied with the popular apologetics that seems to have almost replaced theology in the last few decades, and wanting to go back and really understand theology at a deeper level from these sources.
Oh yeah, I see it. I see it all the time among Catholic friends who like all they kind of not the Catholic answers, but all they know about is what they've heard on Catholic Answers, and all they know what to do is to troll Protestants online, but they couldn't tell you about divine simplicity.
Yeah.
And that's pretty ridiculous, because you read, if you're going to read some solid theologians from the first 16, 17 centuries of the church, and even up through the manualist and into the modern tradition of actual theology, you're going to see that they're placing a much higher emphasis on knowing doctrine of God than being able to troll Protestants with papacy quotes that you got off of one of the websites that just put Katina of quotations up there and think that's apologetics.
Yeah. Yes, we can move maybe from this then to discussing John Henry Newman. There's the late Father Peter Damian Fellner was probably the greatest Scotist theologian of the last few decades. Really thought that John Henry Newman was actually key for understanding the modern world, to understand how to respond to the modern world, because he thought that Newman is actually very, very knowledgeable in the whole tradition, including lots of authors who aren't read it anymore. And Newman's bringing all of that into dialogue in the English language, because as good Americans, we don't like to read anything that's not written in English unless there's a translation, in which case maybe we'll glance at it. But there's a huge amount of Catholic theology that's really important that only exists in Latin. And so Americans aren't going to read it. And he thought Newman was basically the way to get that within the English language.
Oh yeah, Newman's definitely a bridge between not only between modernity and then the ancient and medieval world, but he's also a bridge between Catholicism and Protestantism, because of his deep reading of both sides, as somebody who came out from both a Reformed background before he joined the Oxford movement, and then from a Anglo-Catholic background. He's really well read, and I'm just shocked that he's quoting Reformed authors that I've never even heard of.
Yeah,
and I'm pretty deep within the Reformed authors, especially at school and then writing papers. Like, I've read a lot of Reformed scholastics, and John Henry Newman is just as well read on these guys. And then he's a wonderful patristic scholar.
Yeah,
especially because of he's got that Victorian era education. Like, some of the best education in the world is what he got.
yeah.
So he just, like, reading his notes on anything, he's just quoting these continental authors and ancient authors that people have never even heard of recently.
Yeah. And since this is a channel where I was focusing on Scotus, I do want to mention for people, there's a great article by Father Fellner on the relationship between Scotus and Newman. Because even though Newman does mention Scotus a number of times, and he's very positive towards Scotus the times he mentions him, a lot of the elements of Scotus that end up in his thought are very cryptic, because he tends to blend sources without explicitly mentioning who it's from. And Father Fellner also thinks that in the wake of Pastor Attorneys focusing on the theology of St. Thomas and trying to revive that Newman didn't want to be seen like he was rejecting what Pope Leo XIII was doing. thinks that might have been another reason that the elements of Scotism were played down within his work. But within Justification, which I want to discuss with you here in a minute, Newman does mention that his views are pretty much identical with those of Cornelius Musso, who was a Scotist theologian who was very influential at the Council of Trent. And so I think this is a good bridge then as a point between Scotism, Newman, and Catholic dogmatic theology here.
Yeah, like I've been quite surprised, pleasantly surprised at the diversity of views within the Catholic Church when it comes to exactly how we're going to interpret justification. Because I was talking to a very well-read friend, and I was explaining Newman's view to him, and he's like, "Well, I don't agree with that, especially on the issue of imputation." And then reading through Newman's work, where he's going against what he calls the extreme Roman school, and it's really interesting that justification is a lot more than pop apologetics is gonna tell you it is. Like phrases like imputation and phrases like justification by faith alone, and phrases like these aren't exactly an issue for the Catholic.
Yeah. So I'll have you lay out Newman's view on justification, but first I'm going to lay out sort of the pop apologetics of what Protestants believe and what Catholics believe, and you can show why that's wrong. So the Catholics believe that justification is really just about transforming yourself into becoming a virtuous person and movement towards God. It's entirely about the infusion of grace. It's entirely synergistic. You can entirely choose to accept or reject grace. Then the Protestant view is that even once you're justified, you're never going to do anything good. You're always going to have bad motives, and we're all just snow-covered dunghills. But Christ's righteousness has been imputed to us. So that way, legally, God will basically pretend like a legal fiction in heaven that we're not actually sinners, even though we are, and then magically we'll stop sinning when we get to heaven. So how are those two views wrong? And what's Newman's view as a good sort of actual middle ground of Catholic teaching?